Is this some kind of joke? The voice, sharp and laced with the brittle frustration of a man whose authority was being publicly undermined, cut through the humid afternoon air. Mark Redding, the lead project engineer, slammed his laptop shut with a theatrical clap that made several onlookers flinch. A multi-million-dollar restoration, 1,000 VIPs waiting, and this 10,000-ton pile of scrap won't even hiss? He glared at the colossal black engine as if it had personally betrayed him. The Union Pacific Big Boy number 4014 sat inert and silent on the ceremonial track, a mountain of cold steel that was supposed to be the triumphant centerpiece of the Railway Heritage Festival. Instead, it was a monument to his failure. His team of younger engineers, all clad in crisp matching polo shirts with the corporate logo, exchanged nervous glances. They fiddled with their tablets, running diagnostics that came back with green checkmarks and infuriatingly optimistic readouts. The machine, according to their data, was perfect, yet it refused to build steam pressure. It was a ghost in its own shell. Standing just behind the flimsy velvet rope that separated the technical area from the growing crowd, an old man watched. Arthur Corrigan, 89 years old, stood with a quiet stillness that seemed to absorb the frantic energy around him. His back was slightly stooped by age, but his eyes were clear and sharp. They weren't looking at the laptops or the anxious faces of the crew. They were fixed on the engine, a long, knowing gaze that was less an observation and more a communion. He remained still, hands resting gently on the worn leather strap of the satchel slung over his shoulder, his calm a stark contrast to the escalating panic. A security guard, young and eager to impress the fuming project lead, approached him. "Sir, you need to step back. This is a restricted area." Arthur didn't move his gaze from the silent locomotive. "She's not listening to your little boxes," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that was almost lost in the murmurs of the crowd. "You have to feel her pulse." The guard was taken aback, not by the words but by the utter certainty with which they were spoken. Mark Redding overheard the comment and spun around, his face a mask of indignation. "Feel her pulse? What are you, some kind of train whisperer? Step back, old-timer. We have actual engineers working on this, not sentimental railfans." Arthur finally turned his head, his gaze meeting Mark's. There was no anger in his eyes, only a deep, weary patience. "I'm just saying," he began, but Mark cut him off. "I don't care what you're saying. This is a complex piece of machinery, not a horse. It operates on thermodynamics and precision engineering, not feelings." He gestured dismissively at Arthur. "Security, get him further back. We don't need the liability." The confrontation and its subsequent escalation became the main event. The crowd, initially bored and restless, now had a focal point for their attention. The drama was no longer about the stalled train, it was about the proud young engineer and the quiet old man he was trying to humiliate. Every 5 minutes Mark would announce a new theory, a new attempt. They tried rebooting the electronic ignition system. They tried recalibrating the pressure sensors. They checked fuel lines that were pristine and injectors that were flawless. Each attempt was met with the same profound metallic silence from the big boy. The sun beat down. The VIPs in the grandstand were fanning themselves with their programs, and the local news crew had started a live feed, framing the shot to include the simmering conflict at the rope line. "Sir, I'm not going to ask you again," the security guard said, his voice now firm, his hand hovering near his belt. "Please move back behind the main barrier." Arthur sighed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. He looked past the guard, past Mark, and up at the massive driving wheels of the locomotive, each one taller than a man. "That's a G2 injector valve," he murmured, almost to himself. "They always stick in the heat if the sequence isn't just right. You have to bleed the auxiliary line first. Give her a drink before you ask her to run." Mark, who had been trying to explain the situation to a furious-looking man in a suit, overheard this and stormed back over. "A G2? There's no G2 valve on the schematic. We retrofitted this with a modern EFI controller. Everything is automated." He laughed, a short barking sound devoid of humor. "Where did you even hear that term? Some dusty old book?" He pointed a condescending finger at the leather satchel Arthur carried. "What have you got in there, your collection of train timetables from the 50s? The insult hung in the air. The crowd was silent, watching. The news camera zoomed in. Arthur's hand tightened on the strap of his satchel. He didn't reply. He simply held Mark's gaze, his own expression unreadable, a placid lake reflecting a stormy sky. The young engineer saw only defiance from a senile old man. He didn't see the flicker of memory in Arthur's eyes, the ghost of another time, another place, where that very satchel was a lifeline. The leather of the satchel was cracked and dark with age, the brass buckles tarnished to a dull bronze. As Mark mocked it, the present seemed to dissolve for a moment around Arthur. the scent of hot asphalt and impatient perfume replaced by the sharp metallic tang of coal smoke and fear. It is 1944. The air in the cramped locomotive cab is thick and freezing. Outside, the Ardennes forest is a landscape of monochrome horror under a sliver of moon. Arthur, a much younger man with the same steady eyes, pulls this very satchel from a small metal locker. His face is smeared with soot and grime. The distant crumping sound of an artillery barrage is the only rhythm section for the chugging heartbeat of the engine he commands. This is not the 4014, but one of its sisters, running dark, a ghost train on a secret mission to resupply the besieged 101st Airborne. He opens the satchel. Inside, nestled amongst rolled-up schematics and a driver's logbook, is a heavy hand-forged wrench, its surface imperfect and showing the hammer marks of its creation. It's his most important tool, the only thing that can manually override the frozen injectors in this bitter cold. The satchel isn't a hobbyist's bag, it is his wartime toolkit, a relic of survival. The memory vanished as quickly as it came. He was back in the oppressive heat of the festival, with Mark Redding's sneering face just inches from his own. The young engineer saw an old man with a shabby bag. The audience, through that brief flash, now knew they were looking at something more. They just didn't know what. While the public humiliation reached its peak, a different kind of drama was unfolding on the edge of the crowd. Sarah Jenkins, a junior curator from the Railway Museum, had been watching the entire exchange with a growing sense of unease. Unlike the engineers, she wasn't a technician, she was a historian, and she recognized something in the old man's posture, in the specific, almost reverent way he looked at the locomotive. It was the look of a craftsman, a master, not a mere admirer. She had heard the security guard say the name Arthur Corrigan when he was radioing for instructions. While Mark was berating Arthur about the imaginary G2 valve, Sarah had discreetly pulled out her phone. The term meant nothing to the engineers, but to a historian who had spent months digging through the archives for this very exhibition, it rang a faint bell. It was an archaic piece of terminology from the original non-retrofitted designs. A quick search for Arthur Corrigan Union Pacific brought up nothing recent. But when she added wartime, she got a hit. A single digitized newspaper article from a 1946 military journal. It was a dry, technical piece about logistical innovations in the European theater of operations, focusing on the remarkable efficiency of nighttime supply trains. The article mentioned a special non-standard modification made to several big boy engines for covert operations, and it quoted a young chief engineer, a CWO, Arthur Corrigan, on the challenges of running the massive locomotives in blackout conditions. Her breath caught in her throat. Chief Warrant Officer, a living primary source, was standing right there, being treated like a confused trespasser. Her boss, Mr. Davenport, the museum director, was wringing his hands nearby, his face pale as he watched his career-defining event implode. Sarah knew he was too panicked to listen to a hunch from a junior staffer. She needed to go over his head. She slipped away from the main crowd, her heart pounding. She scrolled through her contacts, bypassing the museum's chain of command, and found the private number for a man named Richards, a senior vice president at Union Pacific's corporate headquarters in Omaha. He was a notorious history buff, the one who had personally greenlit the costly big boy restoration. It was a massive professional risk, but the injustice she was witnessing overrode her fear. She found a quiet spot behind a generator and made the call. "Mr. Richards, this is Sarah Jenkins from the Western Rail Heritage Museum," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm so sorry to bother you, sir, but I'm at the festival. The 4014 is stalled." "I'm well aware, Miss Jenkins." The voice on the other end was clipped and cold. "I'm watching it on a live feed. My head of engineering is making a fool of himself in the entire company." "Sir, that's why I'm calling. There's a man here. They're trying to remove him. He's been trying to tell them what's wrong with the engine. His name is Arthur Corrigan." She paused, then took the leap. "He says it's a stuck G2 injector valve." There was a profound silence on the other end of the line. For a moment, Sarah thought he had hung up. Then the voice came back, completely changed. The cold annoyance was gone, replaced by a stunned electric urgency. "What did you say his name was?" "Corrigan. Arthur Corrigan." The line went quiet again, but this time she could hear the frantic clicking of a keyboard. "My God," Richards whispered. "Miss Jenkins, do not let that man leave. Do not let anyone touch him. I am on my way." The call ended abruptly. Sarah stared at her phone, a wave of adrenaline washing over her. The cavalry was coming. The scene cut to a sprawling corner office on the top floor of Union Pacific Tower in Omaha, Nebraska. A panoramic window looked out over the city, but the man in the leather chair was oblivious to the view. James Richards, Senior VP of Operations, stared at his computer screen, his face ashen. He had just ended the call with the young curator. "Get me General Madsen at Stratcom," he barked into his intercom, his voice tight with an emotion his staff had never heard before. "And get the corporate chopper ready for takeoff. Destination Cheyenne, now." On his screen was a recently declassified internal personnel file, flagged with the highest security clearance the company possessed. The black and white photograph showed a young man in his 20s, his face smudged with grease, a determined set to his jaw. The name read Corrigan, Arthur M., Chief Warrant Officer, U.S. Army Transportation Corps, attached. The service record was brief but staggering. Chief Engineer, Ghost Train Division, European Theater, 1943 to 1945, commanded clandestine nighttime locomotive operations in support of frontline combat units, credited with the successful delivery of critical ordnance during the Battle of the Bulge under extreme conditions, specialized in non-standard field modifications of the 4000 class locomotive. Richards read the last line, a direct quote from Corrigan's commanding officer in his after-action report. "Mr. Corrigan does not operate a locomotive. He communes with it. He kept them alive when by all rights they should have been frozen scrap." Richards grabbed his jacket, his mind racing. A G2 injector valve. It was a battlefield modification, a manual bypass installed to deal with fuel degradation in extreme cold. It wasn't on any modern schematic because it was never supposed to exist officially. It was a secret, known only to a handful of men, most of whom were long dead. They weren't just dealing with a stalled engine. They were desecrating a living monument in front of its creator. Arthur Corrigan wasn't just a former driver. He was a hero of immense, secret importance, and the world was about to find out. Back at the sun-baked festival grounds, Mark Redding's patience had finally and completely evaporated. The public failure, the incessant questions from the media, and the quiet, persistent presence of the old man had pushed him over the edge. He saw Arthur as the focal point of his humiliation, a living embodiment of the old-world knowledge that was making his modern expertise look foolish. He strode over to Arthur, his face flushed with anger, jabbing a finger in the old man's direction. "That's it. I have had enough of you and your senile ramblings," he snarled, his voice loud enough for everyone, including the news camera, to hear clearly. "You are a disruption and a public nuisance." He turned to the two security guards who had been hovering nearby. "I want him removed, not just behind the barrier. I want him gone from the premises. He is officially trespassing and interfering with railway operations." He leaned in close to Arthur, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You wanted to be part of the show, old man. How's this? We'll give you a police escort." He straightened up, his public voice returning. "If he resists, have him arrested. Maybe a night in a cell will clear his head." It was the ultimate overreach, a final irrevocable act of arrogance. The crowd gasped. The security guards looked at each other, their expressions uncertain. They had been tasked with crowd control, not arresting an elderly man on the orders of a hysterical engineer. One of them took a hesitant step forward and placed a hand on Arthur's arm. "Sir, you heard him. You need to come with us." Arthur didn't resist. He simply looked at the hand on his arm, then back at Mark, his expression one of profound disappointment. It was in that exact moment, the moment of ultimate indignity, that a new sound intruded. It started as a low rhythmic thumping, a sound that was felt in the chest as much as heard with the ears. It grew rapidly, a percussive beat that cut through the tense silence. Every head in the crowd, including Mark's, turned and looked up. A sleek black helicopter was descending rapidly, its corporate logo glinting in the sun. It wasn't heading for the local airfield, it was making directly for a large cleared patch of grass just beyond the railway tracks. Simultaneously, a convoy of 3 black SUVs, their tinted windows hiding their occupants, sped down a service road, kicking up a plume of dust. They didn't use sirens, but the flashing lights embedded in their grills cleared their path with silent, urgent authority. The crowd, sensing a dramatic shift in the day's events, parted instinctively, creating a wide path from the SUVs to the stalled locomotive. The helicopter touched down with a practiced grace, its rotors whipping up a storm of grass and dust. The side door slid open and a man in a sharp suit, James Richards, jumped out before the blades had even stopped spinning, ducking his head and striding forward with relentless purpose. The doors of the SUVs opened and several more men in suits emerged, flanking Richards. But it was the 2 men who emerged from the lead vehicle that drew every eye. They were both in full military dress uniform. One was a decorated Air Force colonel. The other, tall and ramrod straight, wore the 2 silver stars of a major general on his shoulders. The spectacle hit the 8-minute mark of the public's ordeal, and the payoff was about to begin. James Richards strode past the stunned event staff, past the open-mouthed Mark Redding, and made a direct line for the one person in the entire chaotic scene who remained perfectly still. He stopped directly in front of Arthur Corrigan, whose arm was still in the light grasp of the security guard. "Mr. Corrigan," Richard said, his voice filled with a deference that was utterly bewildering to the onlookers. "James Richards, Union Pacific. It is an honor that I can scarcely put into words." Before Arthur could respond, the Major General and the Colonel stepped up beside Richards. They came to a sharp, unified halt. Then, in a motion of crisp, synchronized perfection, they both raised their right hands to their brows, delivering a flawless military salute to the stooped old man in the worn civilian jacket. A wave of absolute silence washed over the 1,000-strong crowd. The security guard snatched his hand back from Arthur's arm as if it had been burned. Cell phones, which had been recording the humiliation, were now raised to capture this moment of stunning, inexplicable reverence. The general held his salute, his eyes locked on Arthur's. "Chief Warrant Officer Corrigan," he said, his voice a clear, commanding baritone that needed no amplification. "General Madsen, U.S. Strategic Command. On behalf of the United States Armed Forces, it is my profound privilege to finally recognize you in a manner befitting your service." Richard stepped forward, taking a portable microphone from one of his aides. His voice, now amplified, boomed across the festival grounds. "For those of you wondering what you are witnessing," he began, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before landing squarely on Mark Redding, "you are seeing a debt of honor being paid. This man, Arthur Corrigan, is not just a rail enthusiast. In the winter of 1944, he was the chief engineer of a top-secret Army unit known as the Ghost Train Division." A collective gasp went through the crowd. He and his crew ran these very big-boy locomotives. Richards continued, gesturing to the silent giant, through enemy territory at night, with no lights, often under direct fire, to deliver troops, fuel, and ammunition to the front lines. They were the invisible lifeline of the European campaign. This engine, number 4014, was one of his, and it has been stalled today because it contains unique, undocumented modifications that Mr. Corrigan himself designed in the field to keep it running in the worst conditions imaginable. Modifications our modern schematics know nothing about. He paused, letting the weight of the revelation settle. He wasn't being a nuisance. He was trying to help. He was the only person on this entire continent who could. The murmurs in the crowd turned to a roar of applause and cheers. The news camera, which had been focused on the conflict, now panned to capture the faces in the crowd. Faces of awe, of shame for their earlier judgment, of patriotic pride. Mark Redding stood frozen, the color drained from his face. He looked as though the ground had just vanished from beneath his feet. The legend was no longer a secret. It was now public, undeniable fact, broadcast live for the world to see. General Madsen lowered his salute and turned, his gaze falling upon Mark Redding. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words were quiet, cold, and carried the weight of his rank and the gravity of the moment. "Your diagnostic tools are for machines, son," he said, the word son landing like a physical blow. "That locomotive is not a machine. It is a monument. It is a veteran, just like the man who commanded it. You were trying to command it, to force it into submission with your technology. It only responds to a request from an old friend." The rebuke was professional, precise, and utterly devastating. It wasn't an outburst. It was a clinical assessment of failure, delivered in public. Mark stammered, his technical jargon and corporate confidence completely deserting him. I didn't know, sir. I am so sorry." Arthur, who had watched the entire exchange with his usual calm, gently placed a hand on the general's uniformed arm. "He's a young man in a hurry, General. We were all young and in a hurry once." The grace of the gesture was astounding. He then turned his mild eyes to Mark. "She's not just steel and fire," he said softly, nodding toward the big boy. "She has a memory. All these old engines do. You have to listen to what she needs, not just tell her what you want. You were trying to force the front door, but all she needed was for someone to use the old key." He unslung his worn leather satchel from his shoulder. The crowd watched in hushed anticipation. He unfastened the tarnished brass buckles and reached inside, his movements slow and deliberate. He bypassed the old logbooks and schematics, and his hand closed around a heavy, dark piece of metal. He pulled it out. It was the hand-forged wrench. As he held it, the sunlight glinting off its imperfect hammered surface, the world flashed away again, replaced by a memory sharp as broken glass. A freezing night in the Ardennes. The 4014 is stalled, its injector line frozen solid. Outside, the world is a hell of snow and shellfire. A young sergeant, a blacksmith from Ohio, had handed him this wrench just a week before, forged from the salvaged armor plate of a wrecked Sherman tank. For when the factory tools ain't good enough, Art, he'd said. Now, with his knuckles already bloody from the cold and the stubborn metal, Arthur fits the wrench onto a specific obscure nut on the injector housing. He puts his entire weight into it. With a groan that echoes the groans of the wounded men in the cars behind him, the valve breaks free. Steam hisses. The train is saved. The mission is saved. The wrench had been its key. Arthur walked toward the silent locomotive, the crowd parting before him like water. He didn't climb into the modern, computerized cab. He walked along the massive chassis to a small, grimy access panel below the driver's side, a panel the engineering team had dismissed as obsolete. He knelt, his old joints protesting, and fitted the unique hand-forged head of the wrench onto a recessed bolt head hidden beneath decades of grime. With a lifetime of practiced knowledge, he gave the wrench a firm quarter turn to the left. There was a deep, resonant clunk from the heart of the engine, a sound of release, of a mechanism falling into place. It was followed a second later by a great, shuddering sigh of pure white steam that billowed from the cylinders. A low, powerful rumble began to build from deep within the boiler. The big boy, after hours of stubborn silence, was alive. A spontaneous, joyous cheer erupted from the crowd, a wave of sound that washed over the entire festival. Arthur pushed himself to his feet, patting the warm steel of the engine as if it were the flank of a trusted horse. Mr. Richards, his eyes shining with tears, rushed to his side. "Mr. Corrigan, Arthur, will you do us the honor? Will you drive her?" Arthur looked up at the cab, then at the cheering crowd, and gave a simple, quiet nod. The fallout from that day was swift and decisive. The next morning, Union Pacific issued a formal public apology to Arthur Corrigan, which was carried by news outlets across the country. But they went further. James Richards announced the creation of the Arthur Corrigan Wartime Railman Initiative, a fully funded program dedicated to the preservation of historic engines. Its mandate was to blend modern restoration techniques with the priceless hands-on knowledge of the few remaining veteran operators, ensuring their wisdom would never again be dismissed or forgotten. Mark Redding was not fired. Instead, at Arthur's specific request, he was made the first student in the new program. The epilogue to the public spectacle was a much quieter, more personal affair. 2 weeks later, Mark drove his car down a quiet, tree-lined suburban street and parked in front of a modest, well-kept bungalow. He walked up the path, holding not a tablet or a diagnostic tool, but a simple, empty notebook and a pen. He was not in his corporate polo shirt, but in a plain t-shirt and jeans. He rang the doorbell. Arthur Corrigan answered, holding a mug of coffee. He saw the young engineer on his porch, and a small, genuine smile touched his lips. Mr. Corrigan, Mark began, his voice humbled and sincere. "I know I have no right to ask, but I was wondering if you'd be willing to tell me some stories about her, about the big boy." Arthur looked at the young man, at the notebook, and saw not the arrogant engineer from the festival, but a student eager to learn. He saw the future of his legacy. He stepped back and held the door open wider. "I thought you'd never ask," he said. "The coffee's fresh. Come on in." The story of Arthur Corrigan and his ghost train is a powerful reminder. It teaches us that true expertise isn't always found on a computer screen, and that the greatest wisdom often resides quietly, waiting for us to be humble enough to listen. If you were moved by this story of unassuming valor, please like this video, share it with a friend, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more incredible stories you won't find anywhere else.